On November 18, 1942, above Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the hands of an unnamed Japanese Zero pilot tightened on his control stick as he watched strange, twin-boomed American fighters climbing to meet him. On this date, pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron became the first Lightning pilots to attack Japanese fighters, marking a historic moment that would shatter Japanese assumptions about aerial superiority. Twin-engined, twin-tails, climbing like nothing we have seen, he would later report to his squadron commander at Raval, words that revealed the first cracks in 3 years of Japanese air dominance. Through his canopy, he had just witnessed something that contradicted everything Japanese naval aviation doctrine had taught. American P-38 Lightning fighters, those peculiar aircraft that Japanese intelligence had dismissed as heavy and clumsy, had climbed from sea level to combat altitude faster than his Mitsubishi A6M Zero could match. In China, in the Philippines, and over Pearl Harbor, the Zero had reigned supreme, as no Allied fighter could match its climb rate or maneuverability. Yet here, above this blood-soaked island, American pilots in their twin-engined fighters were dictating the terms of battle from altitudes the Zero struggled to reach. The P-38s claimed 3 Japanese aircraft during this first combat engagement, executing attacks from heights that rendered the Zero's legendary turning ability useless. The mathematics of aerial supremacy were being rewritten not in dogfighting manuals, but in the stark reality of superior altitude performance that would soon demolish every assumption Japanese pilots carried about their invincibility, their aircraft, and their enemy. The collapse of the Rising Sun's air superiority had begun long before that November day, though no one in the Imperial Japanese Navy would have believed it. Since December 7, 1941, Japanese naval aviators had swept across the Pacific with an aura of invincibility. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, with its incredible range, tight turning radius, and highly trained pilots, had earned a fearsome reputation. The Zero's maximum speed of 332 miles per hour at its critical altitude seemed impressive, and its ability to turn inside any Allied fighter made it deadly in traditional dogfights. Among the elite pilots was Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai, a holder of multiple victories, a veteran of the China campaign, and a survivor of countless engagements. By 1942, Sakai had achieved 13 victories in the Borneo campaign alone before being transferred to Lae, New Guinea, where he would score the majority of his eventual 64 claimed victories. His confidence, like that of his fellow pilots, was absolute. Lieutenant Junichi Sasai, Sakai's immediate superior, had addressed his pilots before combat operations, speculating that the American fighters over the Guadalcanal area were likely regular Navy fighters supporting the invasion, specifically the F-4F Wildcats they had defeated before. The early months of 1942 seemed to confirm this Japanese superiority. Their pilots shot down obsolete Brewster Buffaloes over Singapore, decimated Curtiss P-40 Warhawks over Java, and swept aside British Hurricanes over Burma. The Zero maintained nearly complete initial dominance in the Pacific theater. Even when facing newer Allied fighters, Japanese pilots maintained their psychological edge through superior training and tactics refined over years of combat in China. However, intelligence reports filtering back to Japanese squadrons in mid-1942 spoke of a new American fighter, something different: twin engines, twin tails, and heavy armament concentrated in the nose. These reports were dismissed by most squadron commanders who questioned how a twin-engined fighter could possibly threaten the nimble Zero. Japanese naval doctrine, built on the concept of the decisive battle and individual combat skill, had no framework for understanding what was coming.
The P-38 Lightning was the only truly successful twin-engine daytime fighter of the war, the result of Lockheed's response to a February 1937 U.S. Army Air Corps specification for a long-range interceptor. Designer Clarence Kelly Johnson and his team had created something unprecedented: a fighter that could exceed 400 miles per hour, climb to 40,000 feet, and carry enough fuel for missions exceeding 1,000 miles. The P-38's twin Allison V1710 engines, each producing 1,150 horsepower with turbo supercharging, gave it performance characteristics that seemed impossible to Japanese engineers. While the Zero had been designed for maximum maneuverability with minimum weight, even lacking armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks in early models, the Lightning represented a different philosophy entirely: speed, altitude, firepower, and survivability. The first P-38s arrived in Pacific theater not with fanfare, but with mechanical problems. When they first arrived in Australia, design issues were discovered, and their combat debut was delayed. However, by late 1942, these issues were being resolved, and experienced pilots from P-40 squadrons were transitioning to the new fighter. The 49th Fighter Group, still equipped with P-40s but soon to transition, brought with them hard-won experience against Japanese fighters. They had learned, often through fatal trial and error, never to engage a Zero in a turning fight. The P-38 would finally give them the tool to fight on their own terms. November 18, 1942, marked the Lightning's first major engagement with Japanese fighters when pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron, flying from Henderson Field, engaged Japanese aircraft while escorting B-17 bombers. The results stunned both sides. Japanese pilots, flying escort for their bombers, first spotted the strange twin-boomed silhouettes climbing from the south. Their initial reaction was confusion, wondering if these were bombers or reconnaissance aircraft, as the rate of climb suggested neither. By the time they recognized them as fighters, the P-38s had already gained a 5,000-foot altitude advantage. The P-38s would patrol above the altitude at which the Zero could effectively operate, using their great speed at high altitudes to maneuver into the most advantageous positions before plunging from the sky to smash into the hapless Zero fighters. The mathematics were stark. While the Zero's low-speed maneuverability was legendary, its high-speed maneuverability was actually inferior to the P-38 at altitude. Above 250 miles per hour, the Zero's controls became increasingly heavy, and above 300 miles per hour, the aircraft became difficult to maneuver at all. The P-38, with its hydraulically boosted controls in later models, maintained effectiveness even in high-speed dives approaching 500 miles per hour. The shock for Japanese pilots went beyond mere performance numbers. The P-38 represented a fundamentally different approach to aerial warfare that Japanese military culture had not anticipated. The Lightning's armament, 4 50-caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon, concentrated in the nose, delivered devastating firepower in a focused stream that didn't require the complex gun convergence calculations of wing-mounted weapons. The turbo-supercharged engines were equally revolutionary to Japanese understanding. These superchargers made the Lightning one of the earliest Allied fighters capable of performing well at high altitudes while also muffling the exhaust, making the P-38's operation relatively quiet. Japanese pilots often didn't hear them approaching until it was too late. The Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine, producing 950 horsepower at sea level, lost power dramatically with altitude. By 20,000 feet, it was producing barely 750 horsepower. In contrast, the P-38's turbo-supercharged Allisons maintained their power output to much higher altitudes, giving them an overwhelming advantage in the vertical dimension of aerial combat.
By early 1943, the psychological impact on Japanese pilots was becoming evident in squadron reports and personal letters. The mythology of the Zero's invincibility, carefully cultivated since the aircraft's debut in China, was crumbling. Japanese pilots spoke of constant tension, knowing a P-38 could strike from anywhere. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima encountered what was to become a famous double-team maneuver. He noted that while he had no trouble getting on the tail of one enemy fighter, he never had a chance to fire before the teammate roared at him from the side. Nakajima was raging when he returned to Rabaul, having been forced to dive and run for safety. Saburo Sakai himself would later admit that it was no longer possible for the Zero fighters to successfully engage the P-38s except under the most unusual conditions, which unhappily seldom presented themselves. This admission from Japan's most famous ace carried devastating weight among the pilot community. The tactical reality was even worse than individual combat statistics suggested. The P-38's range meant it could appear anywhere across the vast Pacific theater. With a range of 1,600 miles thanks to drop tanks, the Lightning could escort bombers deep into Japanese territory or conduct fighter sweeps far from American bases. Japanese pilots could no longer count on numerical superiority over their own territory. Nothing demonstrated this superiority more dramatically than Operation Vengeance on April 18, 1943,
when 16 P-38s flew a 435-mile interception mission to shoot down Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The mission required precise navigation over water, extreme range, and the ability to engage both bombers and fighter escorts successfully. Major John Mitchell led the mission, flying at 50 feet above the ocean to avoid radar detection before climbing rapidly to intercept altitude. The psychological impact on Japanese naval aviation was devastating. Their most revered leader, traveling with 6 Zero escorts, had been hunted down and killed by American fighters operating at the extreme edge of their range. Zero pilot Kenji Yanagiya, who had been in Yamamoto's fighter escort, witnessed the attack. His testimony revealed the shock at the P-38's capabilities. The Lightning pilots had appeared from nowhere, executed their attack with precision, and escaped before the Zero escorts could effectively respond. The American pilots had calculated the interception to the minute, arriving exactly when Yamamoto's flight was most vulnerable, descending for landing. This level of operational planning, combined with the P-38's performance, represented capabilities Japan simply couldn't match. As 1943 progressed, American pilots refined their tactics to maximize the P-38's advantages. The boom and zoom attack, diving from altitude, firing, then climbing away before the enemy could react, became standard procedure. Japanese pilots found themselves helpless against these tactics. While early encounters had sometimes favored the Japanese, lopsided American victories became increasingly common as pilots gained experience with their new mount. The Japanese attempted various countermeasures, such as using dive brakes to force overshooting attacks, luring P-38s into low-altitude turning fights, or developing new loose formations to better spot incoming attacks. Nothing worked consistently because the performance gap was simply too large.
The P-38's superiority reflected a deeper truth about American industrial capability that Japanese pilots were only beginning to grasp. By the war's end, over 10,000 P-38s would be manufactured, with 18 distinct models representing continuous improvement. Each new variant addressed weaknesses and enhanced strengths based on combat experience. The P-38J model, arriving in late 1943, incorporated hydraulically boosted ailerons to improve roll rate, addressed cockpit heating issues that had plagued earlier models, and featured improved turbo superchargers. Meanwhile, Japanese aircraft development struggled to produce incremental improvements to the Zero design. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius behind the Pearl Harbor attack, privately admitted that they were not just facing a superior fighter, but a system of continuous improvement they could not match. This technological gap was amplified by diverging pilot quality. By mid-1943, Japan was losing its experienced pilots faster than they could be replaced. The grim realities of Japan being unable to adequately replace war losses in materials and skill were becoming apparent. Training programs were shortened from 2 years to less than 6 months, and new pilots arrived at combat units with less than 200 hours of flight time. Conversely, American pilots were arriving with 400 to 600 hours of training. They had practiced combat tactics in advanced training units, studied gun camera footage, and trained on multiple aircraft types. When they transitioned to P-38s, they received specialized training in twin-engine operations and high-altitude combat tactics. The P-38's twin-engine configuration provided another advantage Japanese pilots hadn't fully appreciated: survivability. With 2 engines, even severely damaged Lightnings could limp home on a single propeller. The psychological impact of this reliability was profound. Japanese pilots flying single-engine aircraft over vast stretches of ocean faced death if their engine failed. The Zero's extreme range came at the cost of minimal armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. A single bullet in the wrong place meant the fiery death or a long swim in shark-infested waters. By late 1943, Japanese intelligence warned pilots to avoid duels with the Lightning, noting its terrifying diving speed, accuracy, and ability to appear unexpectedly. Captured documents revealed a growing understanding of their disadvantage, stating that the P-38 must be considered the most dangerous American aircraft in the Pacific,
and advising that engagement should be avoided unless possessing overwhelming numerical superiority. This admission, the Japanese pilots should avoid combat, represented a complete reversal of the warrior ethic that had defined Japanese naval aviation. The psychological impact was devastating for pilots trained to seek combat at every opportunity. The emergence of American P-38 aces provided stark evidence of the fighter's superiority. Major Richard Bong became America's highest-scoring ace with 40 victories, all scored in P-38s. Major Thomas B. McGuire achieved 38 victories before being killed in January 1945. These scores, achieved in less than 2 years of combat, exceeded what most Japanese aces had accomplished in 3 or 4 years of war. Over 1,800 Japanese aircraft would fall to P-38s in the Pacific Theater, a tally representing not just aircraft destroyed, but experienced pilots lost, pilots Japan could never replace. As 1944 progressed, the P-38 continued to evolve while Japanese aircraft development stagnated. The P-38L model featured uprated engines, improved cooling systems, and rocket launchers for ground attack missions. Japanese pilots watching P-38's transition from air superiority missions to devastating ground attacks realized they were facing a weapon system of unprecedented versatility. Beyond the technological superiority, Japanese pilots struggled to comprehend the American approach to air combat. The Japanese had elevated aerial combat to an art form, emphasizing individual skill and warrior spirit, whereas the Americans treated it as an engineering problem to be solved with superior technology and tactics. Commander Masatake Okumiya noted that after the war, they realized fighting spirit alone was insufficient, yet every wartime report of P-38 superiority had been met with demands for greater dedication, confusing courage with capability. By mid-1944, some P-38s were even equipped with primitive airborne radar for night fighting operations, technology completely beyond Japanese capability to match. Night had previously been a sanctuary for Japanese operations. Now even darkness offered no protection. While the P-38 didn't participate directly in the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, its impact was felt in the quality of Japanese pilots who faced the U.S. Navy's Hellcats. Years of attrition against P-38s had eliminated Japan's experienced pilots, leading to the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where American pilots shot down over 300 Japanese aircraft for minimal losses. Vice Admiral Josaburo Ozawa later admitted that their pilots were not ready, lacking the experience to match the Americans. As 1944 turned to 1945, Japanese attempts to counter the P-38 became increasingly desperate. They experimented with ramming attacks and developed phosphorus anti-aircraft shells to target fuel tanks. They even attempted to develop their own twin-engine fighters, such as the Kawasaki Ki-1 or 2, but none reached operational status in meaningful numbers. The Ki-102 was slower than the P-38, climbed poorly, and suffered from chronic engine problems. By early 1945, Japanese pilots no longer spoke of air superiority, but only of survival. The P-38, along with other American fighters, had established complete dominance. The statistics of P-38 operations in the Pacific tell a story of overwhelming superiority. P-38 pilots claimed more Japanese aircraft than any other Army Air Force fighter. Against these achievements, Japanese loss rates told a grim story. By the war's end, Japan had lost over 90% of the experienced pilots who had begun the war. The average Japanese pilot in 1945 had less than 100 hours of flight time. They were not warriors, but sacrificial lambs. Post-war interviews conducted by American occupation forces revealed the full extent of the psychological impact. Commander Okumiya admitted that the P-38 broke their confidence completely, showing them they were wrong about everything from their training to their aircraft design. One Japanese pilot stated he was astonished to find an American aircraft that could outrun, outclimb, and outdive the Zero. Technical analysis confirmed this mismatch. The Zero, with its lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, was designed for a war where individual maneuverability determined victory. The P-38, with its speed, armor, and mass production, represented industrial-age warfare. The industrial context was undeniable. Lockheed produced over 10,000 P-38s using assembly line techniques, while Japan struggled to produce Zeros with declining quality. Each P-38 incorporated thousands of specialized components and precision-engineered Allison engines that were interchangeable, simplifying maintenance. In contrast, Japanese engines required extensive hand-fitting. The training disparity was equally vast, with American pilots receiving comprehensive instruction on twin-engine management, high-altitude physiology, and gunnery, while Japanese training emphasized spirit over doctrine.
The P-38 forced fundamental changes in aerial combat tactics, rendering the traditional turning dogfight obsolete. American pilots developed the high-side pass, diving from above and behind, a tactic impossible without the P-38's performance advantages. The Japanese attempted to disperse their forces or hide in clouds, but the P-38's speed and range negated these efforts. Even the distinctive twin-boom appearance of the P-38 became a psychological weapon, a symbol of technological superiority that struck fear into Japanese pilots. Ground crews reported that the mere rumor of P-38s would cause delays or requests for additional escorts. Strategically, the P-38 demonstrated that technology could create such an overwhelming advantage that warrior spirit became irrelevant. This realization influenced Japanese strategic decisions, including the acceleration of kamikaze tactics and the withdrawal of remaining pilots to home island defense. Admiral Soyumu Toyoda acknowledged in October 1944 that the American fighters had eliminated their ability to contest the skies. Furthermore, the P-38's sophisticated maintenance and logistics allowed for operational rates exceeding 80%, while Japanese units struggled to maintain 50%. The P-38's navigation technology allowed for precise long-range missions that Japanese pilots, relying on dead reckoning, could not replicate. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had built its doctrine around naval aviation, saw its foundation shattered. Carrier air groups were decimated, and by 1944, carriers sailed with half-strength groups of poorly trained pilots. This forced a cultural transformation as younger officers began questioning the Bushido Code's emphasis on spiritual strength over industrial warfare. The economic reality was that Japan could not match the investment represented by the P-38 program, where the aluminum for a single fighter exceeded what many Japanese factories received in a month. Perhaps the greatest humiliation came from the P-38's reconnaissance variants, which obtained 90% of aerial photography in the Pacific. The same aircraft that dominated in combat was mapping their defeat in detail, flying with impunity at altitudes Japanese interceptors could not reach. The shock of this encounter extended far beyond the war, influencing post-war Japanese aviation development and cultural attitudes toward technology. Surviving pilots like Saburo Sakai became advocates for technological advancement, having learned that courage without capability was meaningless. General George Kenney, commander of Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific, noted that P-38 pilots chose when and where to fight, with disastrous results for the Japanese. The top two American aces shot down 78 Japanese aircraft between them, all in P-38s, while the top surviving Japanese ace accumulated 64 victories over 6 years. The mathematics of attrition were unsustainable. The P-38 represented American preparation for a long industrial war, contrasting sharply with the Japanese expectation of a short, decisive conflict. Behind the statistics lay human tragedy. Thousands of young Japanese pilots were sent against P-38s in obsolescent aircraft, resigned to death. Letters home revealed young men who knew their duty was hopeless against the twin-tailed devils.
This impact influenced Cold War aircraft development and American military doctrine, cementing the concept of using technology to create overwhelming advantages. The shock Japanese pilots experienced when they could not outrun or outclimb the P-38 Lightning marked the end of an era in aerial warfare. The age of the individual warrior pilot died in the skies over the Pacific, replaced by industrial-age warfare, where technology and systematic innovation determined outcomes. Saburo Sakai's reflection that the P-38 destroyed the morale of the Zero pilot captured the essence of this transformation. It wasn't just that the P-38 was faster, it represented a way of war Japan couldn't match. In the end, the twin-tailed devil embodied American industrial might and a systematic approach to warfare. As Sakai concluded, the P-38 taught them the hardest lesson of all, that the age of the samurai was over. They had challenged the arsenal of democracy with the spirit of the samurai, and the P-38 Lightning was democracy's answer, delivered at 400 miles per hour from 30,000 feet with a precision that no amount of courage could overcome.